Think about the most coveted and prestigious position at the English royal court in the early 16th century. For this unique position, noble lords were willing to weave dangerous intrigues, betray old friends, and risk their own lives. This position guaranteed a person incredible wealth, immense political influence, and the absolute trust of the most powerful ruler in the realm. You became the only person in the entire vast palace who could spend long hours alone with the monarch behind tightly closed doors. However, this incredible social status came at a monstrous physical and psychological cost, one rarely mentioned in official court chronicles. To fully grasp the horror of this work, we need to trace the story of the decline of one particular human body. This is a story of how one man's physical suffering altered the fate of an entire country and shattered the psyche of his closest servants. We will walk this path step by step, from the days of dazzling youth to moments of absolute physical nightmare. You will learn why survival in this role required incredible luck and a complete renunciation of one's own human dignity. The time has come to open the heavy oak doors of the royal bedchamber and breathe in the stale air of the most dangerous room in Europe. The history of this terrifying profession is inextricably linked to time. The new king was the very embodiment of the Renaissance ruler, with a magnificent physique and boundless energy. The 20-year-old young man, standing nearly 2 meters tall, impressed foreign ambassadors with his incredible physical strength and love for active sports. In those early years, serving him in his private chambers was a relatively easy and even pleasant task for young aristocrats. The monarch's body functioned flawlessly, exuding only the scent of fresh sweat after long hours of grueling hunts or jousting tournaments. It was during these early years of his reign that the position of personal valet acquired its incredible political weight and prestige. Henry VIII deliberately surrounded himself with young favourites, creating a private men's club for the select few within his private chambers. Access to these rooms was strictly guarded, and even the highest-ranking officials of the state had to wait for hours for an audience in the antechamber. The personal chamberlain became the chief gatekeeper of this exclusive world, controlling the flow of visitors and information. Interacting with the king during his morning routine was perceived not as a humiliation, but as a sign of the monarch's highest favour. Each morning began with the attendant bringing a special wooden chair into the bedroom, upholstered in black velvet and adorned with gold studs. A pewter or silver basin was placed beneath the seat, which had a hole in it, into which the monarch relieved himself. During the ruler's youth, this process was quick and accompanied by no painful symptoms or complications. The servant carefully performed his duties with a linen towel, helped the king dress, and simultaneously discussed plans for the day ahead. The air in the room was quickly purified with fragrant herbs scattered across the stone floor of the private chambers. Over the course of the next decade, the position acquired new privileges, transforming the servant into one of the wealthiest men at court. Henry VIII generously bestowed upon his favourites confiscated lands, lucrative customs posts, and lavish gifts. The servant had the right to wear out the king's expensive garments, embroidered with gold thread and adorned with precious stones, which brought in a colossal profit when sold. He slept in the next room, or right at the foot of the king's bed, guarding his master's rest with a drawn dagger. This physical closeness created an unbreakable psychological bond between the two men, based on absolute trust and mutual dependence. However, this idyll of youth and health could not last forever, given the peculiarities of the royal lifestyle of that time. By the early 1520s, the ruler's lifestyle began to take its toll, affecting his digestion and overall well-being. The daily consumption of vast quantities of roasted meat, game, and strong ale began to lay the groundwork for future disasters. Vegetables were considered food for the poor, so they were virtually absent from the royal table, leading to a severe lack of fibre in the body. The monarch's digestive system began to malfunction regularly, turning morning visits to the velvet chair into longer and more difficult ordeals. The chamberlain was now required not only to hand the towel, but also to carefully examine the contents of the silver basin. The colour, consistency and odour of the king's bowel movements became the subject of daily discussion with the court physicians and astrologers. These signs were used to determine the balance of fluids in the ruler's body, and various cleansing procedures or diets were prescribed. You became the chief diagnostician in the state, upon whose watchful eye depended the health of the man who ruled the fates of millions. The odor in the private chambers grew increasingly heavy, requiring the use of ever greater quantities of rosewater and burning incense. Political stakes also rose with each passing year, making the atmosphere in the private chambers incredibly tense and dangerous. In the late 1520s, Henry VIII began his long and painful divorce proceedings, which forever changed the country's history. The personal attendant found himself at the very epicenter of this whirlwind of intrigue, listening to the monarch's angry tirades during his morning hygiene routine. A single careless word or a misinterpreted gesture could instantly cost you the king's favor and land you in a damp cell. You had to walk a tightrope, skillfully soothing the irritated ruler while simultaneously performing your dirty personal duties. The king's physical condition also began to gradually change, complicating your daily physical labor in his private chambers. His muscle mass became encrusted with a thick layer of fat, and his waistline began to increase inexorably with each passing year, helping the ruler get dressed. Pulling tight silk stockings over him and fastening heavy doublets became increasingly difficult. You needed more and more physical strength to support the king as he rose from his toilet stool. The monarch's breathing grew labored, and his body sweated profusely even with minimal physical exertion in a closed room. Despite these unpleasant changes, the position of chamberlain remained the pinnacle of the career ladder for any ambitious nobleman. People were willing to endure any odors and perform the dirtiest work for the chance to whisper their requests directly into the king's ear. None of them could have foreseen the monstrous trials fate had in store for them in the near future. The king's slow decline in health seemed like a natural part of aging, one that did not foreshadow any major medical catastrophes. However, the events of the following years forever changed the rules of the game, turning the prestigious position into a veritable branch of hell on earth. By the end of this period, the toilet rituals had definitively transformed into a complex mechanism for controlling the monarch's physical and political body. You learned to breathe through your mouth so as not to smell the stench, and to maintain an impassive expression at the sight of the king's suffering. Your hands grew accustomed to constant contact with warm pink water and soft linen cloths, which you wielded every morning. You became the ruler's indispensable shadow, the keeper of his dirtiest secrets, and a witness to his gradual physical decline. But the real trials of your psyche and stomach were still ahead, biding their time in the knight's arena. With the onset of the 1530s, daily life in the ruler's private chambers began to take on increasingly gloomy and unpleasant tones. The king's insane diet, consisting mainly of roast beef, venison, fatty game, and sweet marzipan, began to produce serious side effects. The lack of proper plant-based food and vitamins led to chronic problems with bowel motility and constant bloating. Every morning, Henry VIII spent more and more time on his velvet upholstered chair, suffering from painful colic and spasms. For his personal attendant, this meant long hours of waiting in a stuffy room filled with foul odors and the moans of a suffering man. The mechanics of the royal toilet in those days required the servant to have perfect coordination and a complete lack of squeamishness. Next to the chair, there was always a small table on which stood silver bowls of warm water and essential oils. You were required to prepare a stack of the cleanest linen towels which had been soaked in rosewater beforehand to give them a pleasant scent. When the king gave a signal, you were required to quickly and deftly clean his skin without causing him undue discomfort. This procedure was repeated several times until complete cleanliness was achieved, after which the used cloths were folded into a special basket. The contrast between expensive perfumes and the smell of human excrement would cause an unprepared person to experience an instant wave of intense nausea. The rosewater did not eliminate the stench, but merely created a sweetish, suffocating mixture that clung stubbornly to your clothes and hair. You could not wear gloves, as the touch of rough leather might irritate the monarch's delicate skin. All procedures were performed exclusively with bare hands, which you then spent a long time washing with harsh soap in ice-cold water. The smell of this work followed you everywhere, reminding you of your true place in the complex court hierarchy. In the early 1530s, the monarch began showing the first signs of painful hemorrhoids, which made toilet procedures a veritable torture for both of you. Wiping had to be done with incredible care, as the slightest careless movement would trigger an uncontrollable fit of rage and pain in the king. You had to regularly apply special soothing ointments to the inflamed areas, prepared by the royal apothecaries from herbs and goose fat. The process of applying the ointment required the utmost delicacy, as you literally held the ruler's physical comfort in your hands. In those moments, political influence took a back seat, giving way to purely medical concerns and physiology. Your role gradually shifted from that of a trusted political advisor to that of a specialist in intestinal disorders and localized inflammation. You were required to memorize every detail of the king's complaints of stomach pain and relay them to the chief royal physician. Every morning turned into a sort of medical consultation held over a silver basin containing the ruler's still warm excrement. The doctors debated the balance of black and yellow bile, relying solely on your detailed visual observations and descriptions. The treatment prescribed for the monarch and the severity of his suffering in the days to come depended on your attentiveness. Despite these physiological horrors, political life around the commode was seething with incredible intensity and cruelty. It was in 1533 that Henry VIII finally severed ties with the Catholic Church and secretly married Anne Boleyn. All these momentous historical decisions were discussed, among other things, in your company, to the sounds of the royal bowels working hard. You listened as the monarch cursed the Pope, all while writhing in pain from yet another severe bout of constipation. At such moments, you had to skillfully combine words of political support with the presentation of a clean towel moistened with rosewater. 16th century hygiene standards made your job even more dangerous in terms of the risk of contracting various infections. Washing your hands before eating was not a mandatory rule, and the concept of germs did not exist even in the most advanced medical treatises. By drying the king with your bare hands, you risked catching any intestinal infection that could easily send you to your grave. Many servants suffered from chronic stomach ailments, contracting them from their high-ranking master through direct physical contact. The only saving grace was that the strong ale you drank instead of water served as a sort of internal antiseptic. The psychological pressure on a personal servant grew in proportion to the increase in political instability in the country and the king's own paranoia. You knew too many secrets, having seen the king in his most pitiful and helpless state, which made you a potentially dangerous witness. Henry VIII demanded absolute loyalty, and any look of disgust on your part could be interpreted as treason. You had to constantly wear a mask of boundless devotion and sincere concern for the king's digestion. It was a game of survival, where the main prize was your own head, still on your shoulders by the end of a long workday. The first half of the 1530s seemed to you the most difficult trial of your life, but you could not even imagine the scale of the impending catastrophe. Chronic constipation and hemorrhoids were merely a mild prelude to the real nightmare that awaited you ahead. The king's body still retained some of its former mobility, and he could move about his vast palaces on his own. You could still enjoy lavish banquets and political influence when the bathroom door closed behind you. However, time was relentlessly marching toward the fateful date that would divide the life of the entire English court into before and after. You've learned to cope with linen towels and foul odours, built up an immunity to the monarch's whims, and become a true master of intrigue. But neither your political experience nor your physical endurance could prepare you for what would happen on the tournament field. A single unfortunate fall from a massive horse would forever change the ruler's character and turn your prestigious position into that of a bedside nurse. The days of rosewater and political conversations were coming to an end, giving way to the smell of rotting flesh and surgical instruments. Disaster was rapidly approaching, ready to descend upon England and your own life with all its might. The cold morning of January 24th, 1536, began as an ordinary festive day in the luxurious Greenwich Palace, situated on the banks of the Thames. The king was in high spirits, looking forward to participating in a grand jousting tournament that was to demonstrate his undiminished strength. You, as his loyal personal servant, helped him don the heavy metal armor, carefully tightening the sturdy leather straps. Henry VIII, despite being 44 years old, still considered himself an invincible warrior and refused to reduce his physical exertion. No one around him dared to contradict the monarch or point out his increased weight and shortness of breath before the dangerous contest. The tournament took place before a huge crowd, and the air was filled with the sounds of fanfares, the neighing of war horses, and the shouts of the enthusiastic crowd. The king rode into the arena in gleaming armor, mounted on a massive warhorse specially trained for such brutal clashes. During the next charge, at breakneck speed, a terrible collision occurred, causing the monarch to be thrown from the saddle. The man clad in steel crashed with a thunderous thud onto the hard, frozen ground, unable to brace himself for a safe landing. In the next instant, the worst happened. The heavy, armored horse lost its balance and crashed with all its weight directly onto the king lying on the ground. A deathly silence hung over the arena, broken only by the ragged breathing of the animal thrashing in agony as it pinned the ruler of England beneath it. You and the other servants rushed onto the field, heedless of the risk of being trampled by the hooves of the frenzied horse. It took the superhuman strength of several strong men to drag the heavy animal away and free the lifeless body of Henry VIII. The monarch showed no signs of life. His face beneath the raised visor was deathly pale, and a thin trickle of blood flowed from his mouth. For 2 interminably long hours, the king remained in a deep swoon, and many courtiers had already begun secretly preparing for a change in power. When Henry VIII finally came to, his first cry of unbearable pain was forever etched in your memory with chilling horror. Severe leg injuries sustained under the weight of the falling horse exacerbated old wounds the king had received in tournaments several years earlier. Bones and tissues were severely damaged, forming deep internal hematomas that were simply impossible to treat with 16th century medicine. From that fateful day, January 24th, 1536, the ruler of England was never again able to walk fully without assistance or a special cane. The end of his physical activity marked the beginning of the rapid decline, not only of his body, but also of his once noble mind. Doctors employed every means at their disposal. They performed bloodletting, applied hot herbal compresses, and rubbed warming ointments into his mangled legs. Your role changed instantly. Now you were no longer merely bringing the morning chamber pot, but were constantly on duty at the bedside of a monarch moaning in pain. You had to help turn his heavy body to prevent bed sores from forming on the king's back and buttocks. Every turn triggered a fit of rage in the ruler, which he took out on you with a torrent of the filthiest curses and insults. You learnt to endure these humiliations in silence, realizing that the pain was driving the most powerful man in the kingdom mad. It was precisely after this fall that Henry VIII's character underwent a catastrophic change, transforming him into a cruel and suspicious tyrant. Modern researchers suggest that the king suffered a severe traumatic brain injury that permanently damaged the frontal lobes of his brain. Outbursts of uncontrollable rage became a regular occurrence, and his former generosity gave way to manic paranoia and a constant search for hidden traitors at court. Working in the king's private chambers became deadly dangerous, as the monarch could order your execution simply because he was in a bad mood. Every day, you said goodbye to life as you entered the king's bedroom with clean linen towels in your trembling hands. The inability to move around actively led to the ruler's weight beginning to increase at an alarming and uncontrollable rate. His monstrous diet remained the same. He continued to devour mountains of meat and sweets, numbing his constant physical pain and depression. The king's waistline expanded rapidly, transforming his body into a huge, shapeless mountain of flesh covered in expensive velvet fabrics. Assisting such a man during his personal hygiene routines became incredibly difficult from a purely physical standpoint for a single servant. It required exceptional muscular strength just to hold the monarch in his chair and perform the necessary hygiene procedures. The king's injured legs began to slowly decay from the inside, as impaired blood circulation led to the death of damaged muscle tissue. The first dark spots appeared on his skin, which soon turned into deep, non-healing wounds that exuded an unpleasant, sweetish odor. The court physicians insisted that these wounds must be kept open so that harmful, poisonous fluids could drain from the body. They deliberately prevented the sores from closing by washing them with caustic solutions and placing small gold pellets inside the wounds. For a personal servant, this meant a new, repulsive duty, caring for these artificially maintained centers of decay. The fateful year of 1536 brought with it not only the monarch's physical decline, but also a series of bloody political purges. In the spring of that same year, Anne Boleyn was accused of treason and beheaded by a French sword within the Tower. You watched as the king discussed the details of his wife's execution, while you carefully washed his swollen crimson feet. The psychological atmosphere in the private chambers had become so toxic that many servants began to suffer from severe nervous breakdowns. It became increasingly difficult to hide your horror as the slow decay of absolute power unfolded before your eyes. The tournament had forever buried the young, athletic ruler, leaving in his place a bitter invalid, trapped within his own decaying body. Your prestigious position had finally lost its romantic political allure, turning into a daily struggle against the stench of death. You were no longer a participant in merry feasts and secret nighttime escapades. Now you were a prisoner of the royal infirmary. Even darker times lay ahead, when medical procedures would become your primary duty, overshadowing all politics. The monarch's leg was about to present the surgeons with a new surprise that would require incredible composure on your part. By the onset of 1538, the condition of the ruler's legs had deteriorated to such an extent that the threat of blood poisoning had become absolutely real and inevitable. The sores on his shins had spread, deepened to the very bone, and began to ooze thick, greenish pus constantly. The pain became so unbearable that Henry VIII could not sleep at night, filling the palace corridors with terrible, animal-like screams. The court physicians made the risky decision to perform surgery to clean the wounds of dead tissue, an attempt to halt the process of decay. This procedure was carried out without any anesthesia, save for a large goblet of strong wine that the king drank just before the operation began. The 1538 operation turned the royal bedchamber into a veritable slaughterhouse, filled with the stench of fresh blood, sweat, and burnt flesh. The surgeons used sharp knives to cut away the rotting flesh, while several strong men, including you, held down the monarch as he thrashed in agony. To stop the bleeding, the wounds were cauterized with a red-hot iron. The sound of sizzling human flesh is forever etched in your eardrums. The operation did not bring the desired relief, but only exacerbated the situation, triggering a new wave of inflammation and endless physical suffering. The open wounds on the king's legs now required constant and meticulous care, a task entrusted specifically to you. From that moment on, your life turned into an endless cycle of medical procedures that had to be performed exactly 3 times a day. In the morning, afternoon, and late evening, you had to carefully remove the bandages, soaked in pus and blood, from the king's swollen legs. The smell of rotting flesh in the room was so thick that neither burnt sugar nor oriental incense could mask it. You took a clean copia, a special material made of shredded linen, and dipped it generously into strong red wine mixed with plantain juice. With your own hands, you pressed this caustic medicinal mixture deep into the open wounds, trying to clean out the pus that had accumulated over the hours. Your every touch caused the ruler wild pain, to which he reacted with a torrent of curses and threats of immediate execution. You worked without gloves, and your fingers were constantly covered in a sticky mixture of royal blood, pus, and sticky herbal juice. If you moved too slowly, the king would strike you on the back or arms with his heavy cane, demanding that you speed up the painful process. If you hurried and caused him unnecessary pain, he might hurl a heavy silver goblet of hot wine at you. You became a sapper who 3 times a day tried to defuse a bomb made of human pain and absolute power. Wine with plantain, according to the doctors of the time, was supposed to draw out the bad juices and disinfect the huge open wound. In reality, this caustic liquid only irritated the damaged tissue, preventing it from healing and regenerating naturally. Your hands were constantly exposed to this aggressive environment, causing the skin on your fingers to crack, dry out, and become covered in painful sores. You constantly risked introducing cadaveric poison into your own wounds, which would inevitably lead to a painful death from sepsis. But there was no one to complain to, since caring for the monarch's health was considered a sacred duty, more important than your own life. In addition to dressing his wounds, you continue to perform your primary duties of assisting the pain-stricken king with his morning ablutions. Combining these two functions made your work unbearable from the standpoint of basic human revulsion and elementary hygiene. In the morning, you wiped away the king's excrement, and then, with those same hands, having only rinsed them hastily with water, you probed his open, festering wounds. It was the perfect environment for bacteria to be transferred from the intestines directly into the monarch's bloodstream, which only exacerbated the chronic inflammation. But no one understood this direct connection, attributing the king's deteriorating condition to the influence of an unfavorable alignment of the stars and planets. The stench in the private chambers reached such levels that many servants began to suffer from chronic nausea and loss of appetite. The smell of human excrement mingled with the scent of rosewater, the sour smell of wine, compresses, and the sweetish stench of gangrene. This repulsive cocktail of scents permeated the expensive tapestries on the walls and the velvet drapes of the royal bed. You could not escape this smell even during your rare moments of rest. It haunted you in your sleep and made it difficult to breathe normally. Stepping out of your private chambers into the fresh air felt like a true salvation, but such moments were extremely rare. Politics continued to weave its dark web, even to the accompaniment of the king's groans during the painful dressing of his wounds. Foreign ambassadors tried to bribe you to learn the exact state of the monarch's health and assess the chances of his imminent demise. You were bound to keep state secrets, assuring everyone that the ruler felt perfectly well and that his wounds had nearly healed. Any leak of information regarding the true extent of Henry VIII's physical decay was considered high treason. You lied to the ambassadors, looking them in the eye, while your own hands still reeked of the king's pus. The operation of 1538 marked a point of no return in the king's medical history, after which all hope of recovery vanished for good. The monarch spent more and more time in his chambers, hiding his hideous, rag-wrapped legs from prying eyes. His isolation from the outside world intensified his paranoia, making him even more dangerous to the few who remained by his side. You found yourself locked in a golden cage alongside a dying, yet still incredibly powerful and vengeful predator, and ahead lay the coming new year, which was set to break all records for the level of physical and mental horror. Medical dressings became as routine as bringing the chamber pot, weaving death and human waste into a single knot. You became an expert on pus, learning to determine by its color what mood the ruler would wake up in the next morning. Your senses had dulled, your emotions had burned out. All that remained was the mechanical necessity of surviving in this hellish cycle of pain. But the king's body was preparing new trials for you, expanding to dimensions that were difficult even to imagine. A time was coming when one person would be categorically insufficient to attend to the royal body. When the grim year of 1540 arrived, the king's physical condition had reached that critical point beyond which the complete loss of human form begins. The sedentary lifestyle, excruciating pain in his legs, and uncontrolled consumption of high-calorie food had done their destructive work. Henry VIII had turned into a giant whose official weight exceeded the unimaginable mark of 180 kilograms for that time. His enormous belly hung over his knees, and his face was completely covered in fat, turning his eyes into two narrow, suspicious slits. Caring for such a gigantic body required entirely new approaches and a complete overhaul of the established routines for personal hygiene. The king could no longer get out of bed or sit on his velvet-upholstered toilet stool without assistance. To perform these simplest of actions now required the constant effort of at least two strong assistants, one of whom was you. You had to place your shoulders under his massive, sweat-covered arms and, with tremendous effort, lift this mountain of flesh. If the king lost his balance, you risked being crushed by his enormous weight or struck by a heavy cane in a fit of his rage. The process of seating the monarch on the chamber pot had turned into hard physical labour, comparable to the work of dock workers in the port of London. In 1540, the ruler's digestive problems reached their most acute and dangerous phase, turning his life into a constant torment. Weeks of severe constipation, during which the king's abdomen swelled to incredible proportions and hardened like stone, were suddenly followed by bouts of acute dysentery. This illness was accompanied by uncontrollable diarrhea with copious amounts of blood and mucus, making it absolutely unbearable to be in the bedroom. The monarch could not make it to the chair in time, and you had to clean up foul-smelling puddles right off the expensive Persian rugs and oak floors. At such moments, the royal chambers resembled a filthy infirmary for the destitute, rather than the bedroom of the most powerful man in Europe. Your work at the toilet became many times more difficult, as the monarch's enormous belly prevented him from even reaching his own thighs. You had to clean his buttocks and inflamed hemorrhoids after every bout of bloody diarrhea, fumbling blindly with linen towels. All these procedures were still performed with your bare hands, without the slightest hint of medical gloves or protection against infection. You were constantly in contact with infected blood and liquid feces, risking every second of catching a deadly form of intestinal fever. The risk of your own death from dysentery during those months was statistically much higher than the risk of ending up on the scaffold on charges of treason. Wiping your skin with rosewater under such conditions seemed like a ridiculous mockery of common sense and sanitary standards. The smell of bloody diarrhea was so pungent that it permeated your hair, beard, and underwear, staying with you around the clock. You scrubbed your hands raw with coarse sand and soap, but the stench of the king's decaying intestines seemed to have seeped into your pores. The psychological trauma of constantly watching this bloody mess meant you could no longer eat normally. A piece of meat on your own dinner table triggered only gag reflexes and memories of the king's chamber pot. It was during this dreadful year of 1540 that the most dramatic political events surrounding the fall of Thomas Cromwell took place. The powerful minister, who had ruled the country for many years, was arrested right in the middle of a council meeting and thrown into the Tower. You listened as the king, sitting on a chamber pot, surrounded by stench and blood, gave orders for the execution of his once beloved advisor. This surreal contrast between absolute political power over people's lives and deaths and complete physiological helplessness was mind-boggling. The king could order a lord's head to be cut off with a single word, but he could not wipe his own arse without your help. The monarch's rage during this period reached the stage of true paranoid madness, fueled by constant pain and fear of his own death. He suspected his doctors of trying to poison him, and his servants of wanting to hasten his demise due to unbearable working conditions. You had to test all ointments and medicines on yourself before applying them to the ruler's wounds or hemorrhoids. This meant that you voluntarily rubbed unknown chemical mixtures into your own skin to prove their safety for the king. Your life literally belonged to this moaning giant, who could take it at any moment for his own peace of mind. Despite his monstrous size, weighing in at 180 kilograms, Henry VIII's heart continued to beat stubbornly, forcing his body to function at its absolute limit. He demanded the construction of special lifting mechanisms to move between the floors of the palace, as the stairs had become an insurmountable obstacle for him. You accompanied him everywhere, ready at any moment to hold out a silver basin or rush to change the bandages on his rotting legs. You became a living appendage of this enormous, decaying machine, deprived of your own will, desires, and even the right to feel disgust. The days merged into one endless succession of smells, blood, screams, and fear for your own life. Survival in 1540 required a personal servant to completely shut down all normal human emotions and instincts. You had become a machine for processing the king's waste, asking no questions and feeling no emotions. Your eyes saw what no subject should ever see, and your hands did what any London beggar would refuse to do. But the story of this bodily destruction was not yet over, drawing toward its logical and most terrifying conclusion. Death was already standing at the threshold of the royal bedchamber, preparing to take the ruler and present him with the final, most terrifying surprise. The final act of this grim physiological drama unfolded at the end of winter, when the monarch's body, ravaged by disease, finally gave out. On the cold night of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII breathed his last in the enormous bed at Whitehall Palace. For you, his loyal servant, This death was both a long-awaited liberation and the beginning of a new, unpredictable political era. However, even after his heart stopped, this massive 180-kilogram body continued to cause enormous problems for those around him. The process of decomposition of the enormous mass of tissue ravaged by gangrene and infections began almost instantly, filling the chambers with an unbearable stench of decay. Embalming such a gigantic and diseased body presented an extremely difficult task for 16th century surgeons and apothecaries. The internal organs, ravaged by years of poor nutrition and dysentery, were removed, and the resulting cavity was generously filled with spices and aromatic resins. The monarch's body was tightly wrapped in numerous layers of sturdy waxed cloth and placed in a specially crafted massive lead coffin. The lead was intended to seal off the outside environment from the odors of decomposition and preserve the remains in a presentable state until the official funeral. The coffin was sealed and placed on a special catafalque for the long journey to St. George's Chapel in Windsor. The procession moved slowly along the rutted winter roads, and for its first overnight stop, the funeral cortege halted at the ruined Abbey of Seyon. This was the very place where, a few years earlier, the king's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, had been held captive before her execution. The coffin was left for the night in the cold hall of the abbey, guarded by a handful of guards and priests reciting prayers for the repose of the soul. It was in this eerie silence of the ruined monastery that the laws of biology and chemistry prevailed over royal grandeur. Putrefactive gases, released in abundance by the decomposing tissues of the enormous body, began to accumulate inside the hermetically sealed lead sarcophagus. The pressure of the gases grew with every passing minute, until the heavy lead coffin could no longer withstand it and literally burst at the seams with a dull, soul-chilling crack. From the cracks that formed, a horrific mixture of liquefied decaying remains, blood, and the monarch's putrid blood gushed out under the pressure. This dark, foul-smelling liquid slowly trickled down the lid lining, forming sticky puddles on the old stone slabs of the monastery floor. The stench that escaped was so monstrous that the guards fled the room in terror, unable to breathe the poisonous air. The body of the ruler who had held all of Europe in fear had, after death, become a source of biological danger to his own guards. But the most terrifying episode of that night occurred a little later, when stray dogs made their way from the darkness of the monastery courtyard to the coffin. Attracted by the smell of fresh blood and rotting flesh, they began greedily licking the foul-smelling liquid oozing through the cracks in the lead. This gruesome moment was documented in the chronicles by a contemporary of the events, a London official named Anthony. The dogs, lapping up the blood of the once great monarch straight from the stone floor, became a terrifying symbol of the transience of all earthly power. The prophecy of the monk, who had foretold that dogs would lick the king's blood for the destruction of the monasteries, came true with frightening literal accuracy. In the morning, the shocked guards discovered the repulsive scene and were forced to hastily clean the coffin and the abbey floor before continuing on their way. The lead sarcophagus was hastily sealed with soldering irons to prevent further leakage of putrid fluids on the journey to Windsor. For you, the servant who for years wiped this flesh with linen towels, this episode was the last straw in the cup of madness. You realized that all your service, all your fears and humiliations had ended in nothing more than a puddle of rot on the floor, licked up by stray dogs. The rosewater with which you had tried for years to mask the stench of death could not overcome the laws of nature and decay. Henry VIII's funeral at Windsor was held with due pomp, but those who were at Seyon Abbey never forgot that night. The enormous coffin was lowered into the crypt, forever hiding from public view the remains of the most controversial monarch in English history. You lost your position as personal attendant at the privy, as the new king, the young Edward, required a completely different kind of care. Your wealth and influence remained with you, but the price you paid for them forever scarred your psyche. For the rest of your days, you woke up in a cold sweat, feeling the phantom scent of warm pus and wine with plantain on your hands. The story of the burst coffin was carefully concealed from the general public, but within the narrow circles of the court, it was passed on in whispers as a terrifying legend. Anthony and Anthony's records preserved this grim fact for posterity, shattering the idealized image of Renaissance royal funerals. The 180-kilogram body took its revenge on its creators even after death, breaking its lead shackles with the force of its own decomposition. It was the final, most sensational and repulsive manifestation of Henry VIII's physiology in the world of the living, and you were the person who knew every inch of that body better than anyone else on this planet. Freed from your duties, you never used rosewater again in your life and avoided any scent of fresh meat. The power for which you dipped your hands into the king's shit every day turned out to be nothing but an illusion that dissolved along with the ruler's death. Your career at Henry VIII's privy became the most gruesome ordeal the Tudor era could offer a man. And while history will remember the king for his 6 wives and religious reforms, you will forever remember him for the stench of open sores. Surviving in this position required the destruction of your own soul for the sake of serving the rotting body of a stranger. Conclusion. Summing up this terrifying historical reality, it becomes absolutely clear why a modern person could not survive even a single day in this position. The job of a personal attendant at Henry VIII's privy required not just a strong stomach, but a complete absence of normal human instincts of revulsion. You would have had to plunge your hands daily into the waste products of a man weighing 180 kilograms and suffering from bloody dysentery. You would have had to treat the festering, oozing, greenish, pus-filled sores on his legs without the slightest protection or modern antiseptics. And all of this would have to be done under the threat of immediate execution for any sign of carelessness or simple human revulsion. The next time you read about the magnificent balls, jousting tournaments, and palace intrigues of the Tudor era, remember the price of that grandeur. Remember the man with a linen towel in his hands whose job was to clean up bloody diarrhea for England's most terrifying monarch. Appreciate the benefits of modern medicine, sanitation, and the right to human dignity, which even the wealthiest lords of the past were deprived of. History is not just dates and treaties, it is also smells, pain, pus, and the human body's endless struggle against death. And in this struggle, even kings always came out the losers, leaving behind nothing but a pool of blood on the stone floor.